Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Gaming in the Wild, a video games podcast about games from the interesting, artistic, creative side of the tracks, from indie to AAA. My name's John, I'm your host. I'm speaking to you from Reykjavik, Iceland. It's midnight. We actually have nights now. The light changes very quickly in summer. There is no nighttime. We see the sun at midnight, but the seasons swing very quickly and nights are back. It's nice to see the stars in the sky again. It's been a while. And the game that I'm going to start talking about today, I'm going to talk about 3 games on the episode, but the first one is a game that occurs in a perpetual twilight, in a deep, dark forest. It's called Fay-uh. It's by a Swedish company. I believe that I'm pronouncing that right. I looked it up, it means fairy. It's an interesting game that I played in one night last night. I've tried to play it before, but I bounced off it a little. But I decided to give it another go. And so it's nice to talk about it today. It's a good game to talk about in this time of the year when the night's coming back to Iceland. Later in the show, I'll also talk about Bleak Sword, a super cool Apple Arcade game, and I will also talk about A Dark Room, which is a really interesting text adventure. But first, let's talk about Fay-uh. This game was released in 2018. The studio is called Zoink, based in Gothenburg in Sweden. It was published by Electronic Arts, and it came out on Windows, Switch, Xbox and PlayStation. And it's a really unusual game. You play a small creature who wakes up in a forest, a kind of a fox, squirrel, porcupine, bird thing, with spines. It's jet black. The forest is purple and deep blue. Big gloomy trees. And at first you can only carry out a couple of things. You can walk around. You can jump. He has kind of a small jump, this character. It's not like he's bouncing up onto things. He can grab edges and pull himself up. But the most important action that Fay-uh can carry out is to sing by holding down the ZR button, or R2. And it's kind of a strange sound that Fay-uh makes when he sings. It's like a kind of a yammering sound. But as you soon discover from prompts, you chase a deer through the forest. Kind of a deer. All of the animals in this game are kind of like analogues for animals that we know. We recognise the animals, but they're all a little alien. So you get the feeling that this game is taking place in a kind of an alien world, or if you look into it a little, it turns out that Zoink and the team there grew up around the forests of Sweden, and the forests, Nordic forests, have with them a lot of folklore and mythology, really juicy stuff, kind of a gothic fairy tale tradition. And so perhaps the animals that we're seeing are kind of drawn from that. So we chase the deer through the forest a little bit, and eventually we catch up to it and we're prompted to sing. And when Fay-uh sings, the animals sing back, and we can tilt the controller to bring them into harmony, at which point they befriend each other, trust bond is formed, and Fay-uh can learn abilities from animals, or he can ride them, or they'll trail after him through the forest and they'll use their abilities to help Fay-uh proceed. For example, the deer, I think, can bound up hills that Fay-uh's too small to jump up himself, and so the deer starts to open the way forward for us. And this is one of the most interesting things about the game. It's the depiction of an ecosystem. When I was writing out my notes for the game, I always write a couple notes just to orientate myself within what I'm going to say. And I described this game as being about animals singing to each other in a forest ecosystem. And the ecosystem aspect is actually very interesting. It's a wordless game, a little bit like Journey, something like that, or Abzu. And so you kind of have to put the pieces together yourself, which can be disorientating, and it's not perfect here, partially perhaps because of the complexity of the ecosystem. We'll soon learn that some animals have special abilities when it comes to plants. For example, these little kind of rodent creatures that scamper around our feet can they just squeak and they open up a flower that will bounce Fay-uh up like in a high jump. So we have to kind of harness the abilities of animals and plants around us to move through this ecosystem. The animals kind of have their own relationships between them too. It's a largely non-violent game, which is really interesting. Fay-uh doesn't have a hit ability, which makes a really nice change. You can kind of grab stuff, and as you progress in the game, you realise that Fay-uh can pick up like pollen sacs and throw them to dispel webs and things like this. So he can throw, but he doesn't actively harm anything throughout the course of the game. It's a combat-free game, which is a really refreshing change. There are enemies in the game, however. They're called the Silent Ones, and they are presented as an occupying force in the forest. They're kind of big hulking creatures with wide shoulders and little spindly legs and a single white eye. It's like a searchlight. And as we encounter them in the forest, we see them binding up animals and taking them away in a kind of a ball of web. One of our early tasks is to follow the Silent Ones as they kidnap some animals, and we can use the pollen sacs to free the animals and befriend them. And the role of the Silent Ones is and why they are there is kind of the story of the game. But I use story advisedly, because as it's a wordless game, as I mentioned, you have to piece together what's going on yourself a lot. After my 10-hour playthrough of this game, I was really left confused about what the story actually is. So I know that I've made the game sound wonderful, and it has a lot of wonder to it. Wonder is one of the qualities that Fay-uh does very well. But unfortunately, there's a whole raft of things that it doesn't do well. And I know that on this podcast I normally positively review games, but this game I'm going to give a bit of a mixed review. So as we move through this world, befriending animals, singing to them, bonding with them, learning the role of the different flora and fauna, moving through different areas that are delineated by changing light from purple, midnight tones through to bright orange, sunset tones, and deep dark caves and watery areas. And we climb and dive and we learn abilities by collecting crystals. But as we're going through this kind of wonderful journey, unfortunately my attention a lot of the time was not spent on the beautiful depiction of an ecosystem or the beautifully rendered environments or even the fantastic music, which is by Joel Bille. And the director of this game is called Hugo Bille, so maybe they're brothers. I just noticed that in the notes. But despite all of this wonderful audiovisual presentation and a great art style, it's really noteworthy and a real triumph. I spent a lot of the game feeling a bit frustrated. The forest level design is really tangled. It's very easy to get lost. It's very easy to go off track. There is a map, but it's not ideal. And so you can find yourself meandering around. The first time that I played this game, I really didn't know what I was doing at all. And after a couple of hours, I found a bird that I thought I was supposed to befriend, and I was trying to find out how to make friends with this bird and move on in the game. And eventually I just quit. On my second playthrough, I had a much more organically successful experience, I would say. I just explored a little more and I found my way through the game a little easier. When you get lost, the developers obviously knew that this was a problem, because when you get lost you can sing your loudest and a bird will appear, and then it will fly off, leaving a trail of light behind it, and you can follow it towards your next waypoint. But this doesn't work all the time. Sometimes no bird appears, sometimes a bird appears and takes you somewhere, then vanishes. You're not sure where you are, so you summon it again, and then it takes you back where you've just been. So it can feel a lot like walking around in circles. And whilst I appreciate that the developers left it in our hands to piece together the way forward, in some games like Abzu and Journey, it feels like you're being very gently guided through the game. And in Fear, it can feel like you've been left alone in a negative way, in a world where the way forward can become tediously hard to find, and you end up doing laps of a certain area. So this is a game that has some pretty big design flaws. That's one of them. Another is that Fay-uh, you often think maybe you can reach up and grab something, but you can't. You often think maybe you can scramble onto something, you try and you'll fall. There's fall death in this game. Or you might be skirting the edge of a cliff and just slip off and drop down into the ocean or whatever. Or there's like a hole in the landscape and you just find yourself stuck. That happened to me a bunch of times. So it's a bit janky. It often feels like you're breaking the game. And some of the control mechanisms are like that too. Like Fay-uh can learn pretty quickly to scale trees, these tall black pine trees. And he goes up them kind of like a squirrel, so he goes up in 5 small jumps. And often as I was trying to scale a tree, the camera would swing of its own accord. And if you're pressing the button to climb the tree 5 times in quick succession, like halfway up the tree the camera would swing, and because the context had changed, the last push would make him jump off the tree, off into his death. So I spent a fair bit of time rolling my eyes and putting down my Switch and sort of castigating Fay-uh for not doing what I wanted. So this is a tricky game to talk about in a way, because in many ways it's a really interesting and a real triumph, but in many other ways it's a really annoying game to play. And if you try it, you'll probably discover those things in equal measure. But I played it through to the end. I got to the finale. There is a plot twist coming that you may see in advance, but I won't spoil it, of course. But I will say that even after a kind of a plot reveal, I was still left a little in the dark about what the story of Fay-uh is. Something about animals, something about the forest, something about the Silent Ones, but how it all fits together, I don't know. Maybe I'm just too dense to piece it together myself without more guidance, or maybe it's just a very obscure plot. But I will say that this was a really pleasing aesthetic experience, even if the gameplay mechanics let it down a little. It is on sale in the eShop often. I think I got it for £8 around last Christmas, and I haven't played it again until now. I ended up playing it in a single sitting across the course of one night, partially because I kind of wanted to get to the end this time, and I knew that if I put it down, my enthusiasm for coming back to the game would be minimal, and I probably wouldn't do it, but I managed to power on through the game to the finale. I'm glad that I played it. So if you go for it advisedly. That's Fay-uh. The second game I'm going to talk about today is called Bleak Sword. I discovered this one via the Short Game podcast. I really recommend it if you like listening to mellow chats about games, and if you're listening to this podcast, odds are you might. I really recommend it, The Short Game. But Bleak Sword came out in late 2019 and has kind of been getting some attention this year. It's by a company called More 8-Bit, which is a solo developer, Luis Moreno Jimenez, based out of Madrid. The soundtrack is by Jim Guthrie, who also did the soundtrack for Sword and Sorcery and the indie game movie It was published by Devolver Digital, which is usually a pretty good marker for quality, to be honest. I like a lot of what Devolver puts out. And the Bleak Sword, it's an Apple Arcade title designed around swipe controls. You can play it two-handed with your phone tilted over or your iPad, or you can play it with a controller, but the controls are really at their best played one-handed on a vertical iPhone. So it's a made-for-phone game, and made-for-phone games often are puzzle games or the Bubble Witch type thing that make use of the swipe controls to their best. But Bleak Sword is a kind of a Souls-light combat game with 1-bit graphics, which means that they are big pixel graphics in black and white with a splash of red occasionally. Your character is kind of heavily pixelated white knight. The sword is like 4 pixels, just 4 big squares. But although it leans on that kind of 1-bit look, it's definitely a modern game. It's very stylized. It's an art choice because as your character moves forward and back across the square dioramas that you'll fight your way through, he gets smaller and bigger, so he scales, as do your enemies. And the dioramas themselves are you start in a wasteland. It's a small square. Enemies come from the edges of the play area, and you basically have to take them out. And to do so, if you swipe with your thumb, your character will do a dodge roll. That's the only way to move. If you hold for a fraction of a second and then swipe, your character will swing his sword. If you hold for a little longer, then the sword will gleam and you can do a charge attack. And then the final control is that you can, with a well-timed tap, parry light blows. If you parry, then you can also swipe to do a counter-attack. So I hope that sounded as simple as it is in practice. It's very, very elegantly made, because for a combat game where you're dodging around an arena, dodging attacks, swinging your sword, moving out of the range of one enemy and into the range of another, it kind of requires some crisp controls for that to feel good. And I had my doubts about how good exactly that could be, but Bleak Soul plays beautifully. Bleak Sword. I never felt that my deaths were caused by the control scheme or by level design. I always felt like my many deaths were me not quite having my head around tactics or allowing myself to be swamped. Because the enemies come in waves. The game's divided up into 10 areas. I think it's 10, might be 9. And each area has 10 dioramas in it. And each diorama will introduce new enemies or new combinations of enemies. So you might start off with a couple of basic swordsmen that you have to take out, but in the second level it will be a couple of basic swordsmen plus spiders that can throw webs that slow you down, or plus larger enemies that lumber across the battlefield and can take you out in 1 or 2 hits. And so you really have to learn the different moves of the enemies quickly. They introduce one at a time to give you a chance to do so. So the first 5 levels of any given area you'll spend with enemies being introduced, and then the latter 5 is where things get really hairy and tough, and you'll be dealing with waves and waves and different combinations of enemies. It can get very frantic. It can be very difficult. Some levels you just feel like are impossible, absolutely impossible. You're like, how could I take out this many? But as you learn the starting positions, what order the enemies are going to come in, and you kind of piece together your strategy for the level, you will battle through. And I have to say, I did find this a very satisfying game to finish. It's challenging. It's a challenging game, even though it's a small mobile combat game with swipe controls. The combat is difficult, varied. It ramps up considerably throughout the game. Strangely, I felt like the difficulty peaked at around the 7th or 8th world, and then the last 2 were kind of simple. There's also a boss at the end of each level, but the challenge of Bleak Sword comes in crowd control in a way. It's like managing all of these different enemies, be they like a pack of rats that they only take a couple of hits to kill, but there are many of them, and so if you're not careful you can be taken out very quickly, or a giant lumbering swordsman, a ghost that you can only hit with a charged blow, and rats, and some small swordsmen too, you'll spend a lot of your time dodge rolling around and trying to figure out how to best manage this combat situation. And so when you come up against a boss, which is just one big target, it suddenly feels a lot simpler. And so the bosses, a few of them I took out on my first attempt. I think the most was probably 5 or so attempts, whereas some of the levels I think probably in the 20s for the really tough ones. So the bosses are actually a relief when they come. There is also a little bit of other game mechanics. You can level up your character. You can choose whether you would like stamina, which runs down as you charge your sword, or your health, or armor, or your sword. So you can charge up offensive capability too, so you do more damage. I optimized my character to have as much health and attacking power as possible. Didn't really worry about the stamina or the armor, so I played an evasive game and hit hard when I could. You also have 2 item slots where you can put in supplementary items, such as a stone ring that will put your armor up by 3. But that's where the Dark Souls element of this game comes in, along with the dodge rolling gameplay. It's almost like a demake of Dark Souls in that way. I like the term demake, where someone takes a modern game and takes it back to a previous era of gaming with pixel graphics and stuff. You could consider Bleak Souls to be a simple, mobile Dark Souls demake. And the main quality that makes a Souls game is that when you die, you drop your items and power-ups and so forth, or your experience points, and unless you get them back immediately on the next try, they're gone forever. But in Bleak Sword, you keep your characters level, so you can level up and level up. So you keep the experience points that you've put in the bank and put into one of your attributes. But if you have, say, 800 experience points from completing 3 levels, and the next target is 1200, if you die on that next level twice, then you'll lose all of those experience points. And to mitigate this, it gets harder to progress your levels as the game goes on. The number of experience points that you need to get another power-up grows. You have to win more fights to get there. And so if I found myself like at 900 experience points and I only needed 1,000 to power up, I dropped out of the tough later worlds and went back to an early world and just cleared out an easy level like 3 or 4 times, just so that I could put those experience points in the bank. So if you do end up playing Bleak Sword, it's on Apple Arcade. It's the only way to play it currently. It's another good game on the Apple Arcade roster. If you do end up playing it, that's a good tactic that you can bear in mind. And yeah, I think it's the 5th Apple Arcade game that I've played now. Neocab and Manifold Garden, Mutazione, and I've got a bunch more downloaded. So I'm really enjoying Apple Arcade. I feel like I'm a bit of a convert. Some of the games on Apple Arcade are about to be released on Switch and other consoles, such as Manifold Garden, which just came out on Switch. But I think that Apple Arcade is refreshing its roster with new games all the time, and so it's not really about having a big exclusive backlog of games. It's about having access to a sort of a fresh selection, if you like, that you can play on phone, on Apple TV and stuff. This is the second one I've played that seems best played on phone. For example, Manifold Garden and Mutazione and those games I think are much better played with a controller. Neocab was fine on a phone. Bleak Sword, a puzzle game called Grindstone, is fine on a phone. But Bleak Sword is by far the best iPhone-specific game on Apple Arcade, and I think that most gamers that are interested in Souls-like gameplay would enjoy this game. So I hope that more people get to play it and that it's not just only Apple Arcade players, because I know that that's not the majority of gamers. But anyway, Bleak Sword comes highly recommended. I had a really good time with it. I hope that review made sense. I think I might have got into the weeds on the mechanics a little bit, but that's Bleak Sword. That's some more music from Fay-uh, because the next game that I'm going to talk about doesn't have any music at all. In fact, it doesn't have much of anything. It's called A Dark Room. It was originally released in 2013 by a Canadian indie studio called Doublespeak, and it came out later that year for Apple devices via the iOS store. Since then, it's been ported across to Switch and Android. This is a very, very unusual game. It is a text adventure, but not in the traditional sense. It uses only keyboard characters as graphics. So at the start of the game, you light a fire in a dark room. I'm looking at the game on my phone now. There is a button in the middle of the screen that says light fire. When I press it, the screen turns white with a lit room, and then the button says stoke fire. I can press supplies, and I can visit the builder. And as you light that fire, people come and gather around it, and then you can start to do things. You can, for example, chop wood or go hunting. And as you collect more wood, you can build huts, and the more huts that you build, the more people come to live. So since I started recording this segment, I can look at my phone right now, and it's kind of time-based what happens. So I lit the fire, and a text readout says the room is hot. Builder says she can make a cart for carrying wood. Builder says she can make traps to catch creatures. So if I tap on build, I can build a trap for 10 wood. I can build a hut for 140 wood. The wood replenishes as time goes on. So this is a time-based game. You have to kind of pay attention to it. I can have stoked the fire, and the text readout says the fire is roaring. It says builder puts up a hut out in the forest, says word will get around. More traps for more creatures. And then it says some strangers arrive in the night and take up residence in the hut. Those strangers become workers, and they start producing more wood for you to build more huts. And before you know it, you've built up a village just through using this time-based text mechanic of resource management. The new wood comes every 10 or 20 clicks, and so it goes up and down based on how much you're building. And then the final mechanic of the game, and this is where it really gets interesting, is that after you have enough resources to build a compass, something new appears, and that is a button that just says a dusty road. And when you click on a dusty road, you can set out on an expedition. What happens when you click that is that a map appears, but it's really just a bunch of full stops that you are represented by a letter, and you can go north, south, east and west. And then occasionally you'll see another letter. When you reach it, it's a location. So it's a text adventure with a kind of a map made out of keyboard characters and a time-based mechanic. And across the time that I played this game, I think it took me 4 or 5 hours to complete, but I played it across months. So every now and then I would just open a dark room, stoke the fire, collect some wood, build more huts. And it progresses in a really fascinating way. The story isn't what you first think it will be. It goes to some interesting places. I think this game is best played on a phone again. Much like Bleak Sword. It is available on the Switch, but I think the small, super responsive iPhone screen is perfect for this game. I think I got it for £2 or something. I can heavily recommend it. It's kind of compulsive to play. And I mean, it's described online as a online text-based role-playing game, an adventure game, and an incremental game. So it's quite unique in that way. A narrative game with this cool interface, the text that paints pictures in your imagination as you progress. Like you'll find like a house out in the wilderness on the map. You'll find all kinds of things out there. You'll find hostile creatures, so you have to go back to base and kind of learn how to fashion weapons and so forth. And it really progresses in a fascinating way. I'm not going to say any more about it because I think it's best experienced. But I do heavily recommend A Dark Room. It's a really unusual one-off game. It's available for iPhone, it's available for Android. You can pick it up in the App Store. It's also playable as a browser game, so you can Google it and find it. But I think it's worth paying a couple pounds to play the app version. When you get to the end of it, there's a cool thing that unlocks, so it's worth getting to the end too. So I hope you enjoy it. That's A Dark Room. So that's the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. It is unintentionally a night-themed episode. All three games are played in dark environments, and they all have elements of darkness that bring them to life. Whether that is the mystical forest of Fay-uh, or the kind of harsh landscape of Bleak Sword, or the literal dark room where that text adventure begins. But those three games, I think Fay-uh took me 10 hours and the other two took me 4 or 5 to complete, maybe a few more for Bleak Sword if I count in the many deaths and sessions that I had. But those last two, I've realised now, are playable for anyone, so you don't have to have a PlayStation 4, you don't have to have an expensive Switch or a gaming setup. Anyone with a phone can play those two, or an iPhone at least. And as I've said before in this podcast, not a lot of my friends are gamers in inverted commas, but when I talk to them about how many games I'm playing and how much my interest in games has blossomed over the last 12 months, after that long break that I took from 2010 up until 2019, they all have played games. They all, everyone has fond memories of some game or other and has some sneaky game on their phone that they tend to play, even if they're not gamers. They're aware of games, they play them quietly. And so I find these games that serve as an entry point really interesting, because anyone can pick them up and play them. My attention span isn't always there for a game where I'm going to play a 3 or 4 hour session, and that's going to take me 40, 50, 100 hours to complete. I do in the background have a Death Stranding game going on. I watched Coalsburgers, the Twitch streamer, he's one of my favourites, play a session of Death Stranding recently, and it kind of inspired me to power through this really difficult spot that I was stuck in and get to Lake Knot City. So I did that, and I have to say the plot is really picking up in Death Stranding. I also watched another streamer, Girl with Box, play a session of Red Dead Redemption 2, and that made me want to pick that game back up. I've played, I think, 6 or 7 hours of Red Dead Redemption 2, and so, winter is starting to come here. Like I said, the night has returned in Iceland, and I think that as the seasons change, I'm gonna find myself with more time and more attention for lengthy experiences, rather than the kind of 5 to 10 hour games I'm playing currently. I did also in this period play Piku Niku, which I was going to talk about in this episode. It's a really fun, easygoing Switch game. Again, it's like a discrete 4 or 5 hour experience, but it's very different in tone to the games that I played in this episode. It's much more cheerful. It's kind of a silly, cartoony game. But I think I'll save that one for a future episode, because those 3 that I talked about today, they all fit together quite nicely. Before I finish though, I will talk briefly about the Nintendo Indie Direct that took place this week. I've watched a couple of Indie Directs, and there's been like maybe one game that leaped out and a bunch of stuff that I wasn't thrilled by or kind of excited by, but this one was very different. Some games came out that I've covered on previous episodes of Gaming in the Wild. If you've been listening a while, you might have heard on episode 3 I talked about the game A Short Hike, a solo developer, kind of cartoony exploration game with a deeply relaxed atmosphere. And Manifold Garden also came to Switch, and they were both released the day of the Indie Direct. So I got a hold of both games. I'm going to be reviewing A Short Hike for Switch Indie Fix, a really cool Switch website that I really enjoy writing for. And I'm going to be reviewing Manifold Garden for Nintendo World Report. And having podcasted about those games and played them on other platforms, I was really happy to have an opportunity to revisit both of them on Switch in a handheld format. They both play beautifully, they're both highly recommended. I've completed Manifold Garden for the first time on the Switch, and Short Hike I'm working my way through now just to refresh my memory of it. Also coming out is Subnautica. I own that one on PlayStation 4, but I'm yet to play it, but I'm really excited to get into it. I think after No Man's Sky, I was a little bit done with kind of resource management and exploration games, but when the mood takes me again, I will definitely get into Subnautica. So that Indie Direct was a really welcome surprise. There was a whole bunch of other games in there too. I'm going to go back and look through it all. But the conversation continues on Twitter about all of these games and more. So if you'd like to come and find me there, I'm at Gaming in the Wild. I'm also Gaming in the Wild on YouTube, where I'm starting to post more specifically made for YouTube videos, and on Instagram, where you can follow the games I'm playing, and on Twitch, where I live stream games sometimes. So I'd be really happy for you to join me on any of those platforms. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. See you next time. Take care of yourselves and each other. Bye bye.